Hi, everyone. For those of you joining us, I'm just going to give it a little bit to let everybody get in the room before we get started. Okay, it seems like we're about there. I'm sure there's going to be a few late arrivals, but that's all good. Hi, everyone. I'm Clay Pruitt. I am the ShortFest forum producer. I am so thrilled to be able to put on the ShortFest forum this year, despite the circumstances, in this new virtual format, and so happy that we can provide this to people all around the world. So I'm not sure where a lot of our attendees are calling in from, but I would assume they're all over. So it's kind of exciting to make this happen. And for this particular panel in particular, it's a great topic. I don't believe we've ever really touched deeply on documentaries in the past at the forum, so I am thrilled to have this incredible panel to speak to you all. Before I get started, I want to say on behalf of the festival, we want to acknowledge the pain and anger that we're all feeling right now. Not just about the most recent events we've witnessed, but also the long-standing history of injustice and inequality. We stand with Black Lives Matter, and we are committed to working together to move our community, our country, the world closer to unity, understanding, and inclusivity. Just before we kick things off, one quick note. We are going to be using the Q&A function for this panel, which is located at the bottom of your screen. If you do have questions, please place them there. We will get to those near the end of the session, but no need to put those in the chat. And just for your information, this session is being recorded for future use. Without further ado, I want to kick things over to the moderator for this panel, Pat Saperstein from Variety.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here and welcome. And this is a really exciting time to talk about documentaries. So I think that this is a great panel for today. So I wanted to get started by having everyone give a little quick introduction about what you do and what your involvement with documentaries has been. And then we're going to go around and also hear some little short case studies about just how people have gotten documentaries off the ground and kind of some tricks that they've learned, not tricks, but tips that they've learned along the way. And then we'll go into some more specific questions. So Deanna, do you want to start off?
I hate going first. Yes, my name is Deanna Winkler. I am an independent filmmaker in LA. I directed, wrote, produced, did the many things you do as an independent filmmaker on a feature documentary called United Skates. It premiered at the Tribeca Film Festival. We did about 140 more film festivals after. It's now on HBO, and we had many grants and support along the way. So feel free to pick my brain on how we raised the money we did and that's it.
And I just wanted to say I just watched the film and I loved it, and I'm going around telling everybody that they have to watch it now. So
Thank you.
So glad that that we got to meet.
Thank you so much.
And find out about it. Claire, can you go ahead?
Sure. Hi, my name is Claire Tucker. I am the head of production at Super Films, which is a small production company in Los Angeles where we focus on telling, inspiring, heroic, timely stories. And I worked actually as a reality television producer for like 12 or 13 years until I finally hit a wall and just didn't want to make that kind of content anymore. So kind of, took a big pay cut, to be honest, to work on my first documentary film, but there's just really no turning back. I just fell in love with the medium, where I felt like the priorities were more in line with my priorities as a storyteller. and have been working on documentary films ever since. That was about 4 years ago.
Great, thank you. And Andrew?
Hey, everybody. It's great to be with you this afternoon. I am also myself mourning the premiere of a film that I was going to be having in April at Tribeca. So I'm so glad we can all be here together in this moment, but hopefully soon, maybe in the fall, we'll be able to see each other in person. I'm a producer and director based in Mexico City with a background mainly in talent and project development. I worked at the Independent Filmmaker Project for a long time out of New York, and also with the Tribeca Film Institute, programming and overseeing their project market, the TFI network. I relocated to Mexico about 3 or 4 years ago, where I started working for a film festival here in Mexico. Started coming for a few months at a time and eventually moved here full time, and kind of switched gears to filmmaking in 2016. And the film that we have this year is called 499. It's a hybrid documentary looking at the legacy of colonial violence in Mexico upon the 500-year anniversary of the conquest, which is next year. And I'm producing with another producer here in Mexico. The director is Rodrigo Reyes, who's based in the Bay Area. And yeah, we're currently figuring out next steps for the film, but have been fortunate enough to win a couple prizes in this virtual moment, and just seeing what opportunities will await the film in 2021.
Great. And Roddy?
Thank you, Pat. I'm Roddy Taylor. I'm a filmmaker, but I work as an executive, mostly in documentary and nonfiction. And I focus on artist development and support. Previously, I worked at Sundance Institute for 10 years, where I was the head of the Sundance Documentary Fund, which is a global film finance fund that supports many independent storytellers. And about 3 years ago, I joined Concordia Studio, which is a new mission-driven studio founded by filmmaker Davis Guggenheim, producer Jonathan King with Lorene Powell Jobs, to produce and finance the next generation of story-driven nonfiction. At Concordia Studio, I had our fellowships in artist development, which does have a diversity focus. My diversity frames right now are race, region, and religion in the United States.
Great, thank you. And Dana?
Hi, my name is Dana Merwin. I'm with the International Documentary Association, which, if you don't know the IDA, go over after this is done to documentary.org. We're a member-supported organization that has been around for over 30 years, typically based in, not typically, but we are based in Los Angeles. I am an outlier. Along with my colleague, Carrie Lozano, we make up the grants department. So yes, we are a whopping department of 2. And we've been with IDA since 2017. Before that, both Carrie and myself worked at Al Jazeera America, which is where we met. And we like to let filmmakers know that we too have production background. Carrie is a prolific documentary filmmaker, and I come from a wonderful mixed bag of production management, from reality television to independent features to documentaries. And so that was kind of my segue from production into nonprofit and then into the funding side of IDA. So if you do have any questions about grant writing and grants, we oversee 2 different funds right now. But I've been having the pleasure of going around the country with some of our grantees and hearing from these amazing filmmakers, similar to what Deanna offered, and advice on how you even go about fundraising. So thanks for having me.
Yeah, that is just a very important organization for you guys to be involved with, and hopefully be able to get some knowledge about financing your projects as well. And since we're with you, Dana, do you want to start off by talking about a film that you worked on or with the filmmakers of, to kind of help it get out into the world?
Sure. So I guess I'd step back and say, with since Our involvement with IDA, both of our grants are from philanthropies. So our largest grant is the Enterprise Grant, and we fund both films, feature films in production, but then we also have a development fund that is for any medium. It can be shorts, podcasts, features, whatever is emerging. We want to be the first people in when we do development funds, and those grants are $15,000 each. And we've been doing that since 2017, and we fund 10 projects each year. And you can find all of our grantees online. To speak specifically to this festival in this moment, I kind of flagged two different cases. In 2018, we funded Life Overtakes Me, which is John Haptis and Chris, oh my goodness, what's Chris? Help me out. Someone's gonna tell, Samuelson, thank you. Which they're Bay Area filmmakers. And we funded their short film, which has now been distributed on Netflix and was nominated for an Oscar, about refugees in Sweden who were suffering, their children were suffering from like a coma-induced stress from having to leave their home countries. And so that's an instance where we have a really extensive review process that involves different filmmakers and different entities. So it's not just myself and Carrie. We do an extensive review process to end up with, we start with 300 applications and we end up funding those 10 films in development. And what's specific about our funds is that they are a cross-section between documentary and journalism. So we're trying to make documentary filmmakers better journalists and journalists better documentary filmmakers, and all the benefits that come from both of those fields and really connecting them. And Life Overtakes Me is a wonderful example of one of those films, but in terms of our involvement in it, we don't have creative input. We don't have any editorial insight. So once you receive a grant from us, those are your funds to do as you choose. And so it's a wonderful thing that Life Overtakes Me had such a great run, both in festivals, a lot of awards in festivals, and that it was acquired by Netflix, and it did get nominated for an Academy Award. But another one that I would like to talk to you about is a film that, a series that's actually premiering June 29th, which is And She Could Be Next, which is from two amazing filmmakers, Marjan Safina and Grace Lee. And that is appearing on POV at the end of the month about the women who ran in the midterms, all the women of color who ran during the midterms. And when that came to us, it came to us as a feature. And with the same thing, as I talked to those two filmmakers in their grant writing process, Marge told me, she's like, I said, where did it even start? Like, where did it even start, this idea? And she's like, well, we knew we wanted to make this film. And the first person that we asked was a private donor. And she's like, look, even if this doesn't, if the bare minimum will happen is there will be a short. So that's really interesting to me because she, you know, the very first person that she got funds from, she's like, you know, even if we don't go to a feature, even if we don't, you know, go to a series, that wasn't even the dream at that moment. She promised that first investor there would be a short. So I think that really goes to both of those instances, or to the power of shorts. Now, And She Could Be Next is now a 2-part series. And it just grew, and she ended up raising $2 million to do the series. But it all started with a small private donation. So I think when we start talking about funding and what that map looks like, especially for American filmmakers, it's different for everyone. But I think it does take a collective. There's not just going to be one way to get your short made and one way to get it distributed. This wonderful panel will speak to their individual experiences. So from IDA, it's almost hard to narrow it down to one, because all these different filmmakers had different resources and were at different stages in their career. But I think that And She Could Be Next is a really wonderful example. And the last one I would mention is another grantee called Mama Bears. And that's Darisha Kai, who is a filmmaker in Georgia. And she wanted to make a film about, and she started with the story. What's the story? And in all of these instances, they're like, what's the story? And for Darisha, she wanted to make a film about evangelical mothers who are supporting their transgender children. And she's like, that's the film I want to make. I want to make it as a feature. Same thing. She went to a private donor who she knew was very passionate about the subject matter. And she's like, I want to go out for one day of shooting on this specific event. And she had a very specific ask. And she got that shoot done, and then it just kind of the momentum kept growing. And then the ACLU had an open call for films. This specific story met their call for entries. So I also kind of back into that when you're looking for fundraising, look for an issue-oriented organization. Now, Dorisha ended up making that short film, which was, I believe it's called Trans in America, and it appeared as a short film with the ACLU, got distributed through them, and then they actually said, you can keep all the footage. Footage belongs to you. So now Dorisha is making a feature film based on that short. I'll stop talking. Those are three very different projects that we were proud to support in many different ways, but the filmmakers definitely led the charge, and we were just there to support them in a few different ways.
That's really helpful. And I think two of the more interesting aspects also about what you mentioned are, first of all, look for an issue-oriented organization. So, you know, allying yourself with something like the ACLU that has grants or funding available is a great way to go. And then the other thing about how it turned into a series, or, you know, just the path to how you decide if it's going to be a feature or a series or some other format entirely. Somebody mentioned podcasts. I think that that's also a fascinating thing right now that a lot of people are confronting, that maybe they actually had a series and not a feature, or vice versa. So if anyone else has any other anecdotes on that, that would be interesting to hear. So Claire, do you want to go ahead?
Sure. I think the film I'm going to talk about is the second feature film that I produced, which is called The Mars Generation. And it originally came about. Time magazine has a film division called Time Studios, and they approached the director, Michael Barnett, about making actually just a digital web series about space camp. In 2016, Space Camp in Alabama had changed its curriculum to include to teach the kids how to go to Mars instead of the moon for the first time. And so, you know, Time Studios thought it would just be a cute little web series, follow these kids for a week and edit it to a couple of short episodics. And we were there for about 2 days when we realized this is a film, this is a much bigger story about where we are as a country in terms of our space program and what's happening in the private sector and what's happening at NASA and what's happening with NASA funding. So we went back to Time and said, good news, we want to make a feature. And they said, that's wonderful. We're not changing the budget though, but go ahead. You know, we support you creatively, but the budget is staying the same. So we had the challenge of making that budget for a small web series work for a feature film. But we did, you know, I can get into more details of that if anyone has questions on how to spread a small budget out for a big task. But it was wonderful. We made a feature film. It ended up getting into Sundance 2017. It was picked as one of the opening night films. And then we sold it to Netflix as a Netflix original.
Great. And Roddy, did you want to talk about a filmmaker or a film that you've worked with?
Yeah, of course. So at Concordia Studio, I have about 15 fellows between active and alumni, and they range between people working on short content to people developing features or even developing series. But one of our first fellows is a filmmaker. Her name is Garrett Bradley, and she came in with a short. It was intended to be a longer short, sort of a companion piece to a short called Alone that that was published on OpDocs with the New York Times. It's a beautiful, really powerful short. And this is a separate set of characters, but sort of a conversation piece or companion piece to that, a longer short, and about a woman in Louisiana who is on a 20-year mission to get her incarcerated husband out of prison. And it's a love story, basically. And she's a successful businesswoman, and she's raising their 5 boys. It's an incredible story. And in the course of the fellowship, actually, there was a dramatic turn of events. And so we gave Garrett additional support. And I don't want to blow it in case anybody's going to see it because it's going to come out soon. But we gave Garrett additional support to go back. She was editing at Concordia, to go back to New Orleans and to keep filming. And she followed the story, which expanded. So it was a natural expansion of the story from a short to a feature, and more support to keep editing, to work with a top editor and so on. So the film did organically become a feature. It was submitted to Sundance, where it premiered just this January. Time does weird things. That feels like 5 years ago. But and then it won the Grand Jury Prize. It was bought by Amazon Studios, and it will be coming out soon, very soon, to folks near you. So it's one of the exciting things that can happen to short content, although I think that you know, if a short needs to be a short, that's probably the best thing for it. You know, not to kind of stretch it out or anything like that. Like, this actually had more dramatic material to it. I think there's an ongoing evolution in the shorts landscape, generally speaking. I've always said that, you know, everybody wants to program and curate, you know, short content on their websites and streaming and so on. They just don't want to pay for it, right? So there is a landscape for short content. There isn't really a strong economy for short content, as you already know, because you're the ones doing it, filmmakers. But I think traditionally there are the journalistic outlets that want to have short content for their platforms. Some cases, there's some, you know, small broadcast spots, and limited capacity, there are streamers who pick up shorts, often for a high price point, but tied to their press, a press and prestige strategy as they try to launch their premium nonfiction division, right? So those are the places where I see shorts really living in the world. Again, there's an ongoing development of the field, but I always enjoy trying to look at that 30,000 foot view to say, okay, what's happening out there in our ecosystem, because that has an impact on the experience, you know, that filmmakers have. So happy to say more about that as we go.
For sure. Thanks a lot. Andrew, do you want to tell us a little bit about how you got 499 off the ground?
Sure. So yeah, 499 is the first feature that I've produced after working on a handful of shorts over the last few years. It's definitely a learning curve. As you know, as you guys all know, producing a short alone is a lot of work. Producing content, you know, 3 times as long is just, you know, it just expands the amount of work, of course, and the amount of fundraising that's required to do so. Our film 499 has been funded pretty much entirely through grants, all of which are non-recoupable, meaning that none of the grants had to be paid back. The one grant that we received from the Mexican Film Institute is essentially treated as an investment in which they will participate in profits on the film, hoping that, you know, the film does make profits next year. But I guess basically the genesis of the film started out in 2016 as an idea between Rodrigo, the director, and my co-producer, Inti Cordera, looking at this upcoming anniversary of the conquest in Mexico, which in many ways is going to be kind of treated as a celebration here. They're like going to be changing some of the coins to celebrate this anniversary. And of course, you know, there's a legacy of violence that still exists in Mexico today, which Rodrigo really wanted to explore through the lens of documentary and through the lens of this fictional character that we imagine sort of like reappearing in Mexico today. And he traces the same path that Cortez and his men took from the beach to Mexico City, the present day capital of Mexico. So the project was originally developed in 2016. Rodrigo had received a grant from the Guggenheim Fellowship the year before. So he used some of his monies from the Guggenheim Fellowship in order to really research and develop the project and connect with journalists and fixers here in Mexico who helped us meet a lot of the characters that we meet in the film. Also connected with a lot of academics who supported a lot of our applications for grants, which was a huge part of the process. Our first shoot, there were 2 shoots that took place in 2018. Each shoot was about 2 weeks, which is not very much for a documentary. We were working on a super bare bones budget at that point. So we're shooting with monies that we received from Rodrigo's fellowship, but also with a small amount of cash that my co-producer had put up through his production company here. And he also runs a documentary festival here in Mexico City called DocsMX. So we were able to work to build a crew, you know, with a really strong backbone of the production company of Inti here in Mexico City, and then had those 2 shoots in 2018 and participated in Independent Film Week at IFP in between those shoots, using a teaser that we created from the first shoot. And really a lot of the conversations that we're still having today and that sort of have impacted the life of the film were started at IFP Week. So we met a sales agent at IFP Week who we're still working with today. And we also met programmers at Tribeca at IFP Week, who then later selected the film to premiere in 2020 of this year. So as we all know what happened with COVID, Tribeca got postponed, and also Hot Docs was to be our international premiere. Hot Docs did a virtual version of the festival, which was available for like, I think 500 people were capped at each screening. And our sales agent really didn't want us to participate in that. They thought it might hurt chances of the sale in Canada, but we really said, you know, we want, if anything, if this is the audience that can see this film now, we want to start building buzz and also, you know, having people talk about the film. And for us, the film really is a critique of colonialist systems that have existed over hundreds of years. And we're seeing in this moment how obviously these systems are not functional and they're completely falling apart. So for us, it's been really important to share the film in this moment and continue seeking opportunities for screenings. And yeah, we're still in the moment. We're constantly fundraising. I'm still fundraising for the impact campaign of the film, which, you know, the actual 500-year anniversary of the conquest is next year. So although this moment we still have a bit of time, it would be really crucial for us to be able to release the film in Mexico next year. And we would like to do a traveling community tour of the film along the route that we shot in many communities where traditional cinemas don't exist. So we're still fundraising for that tour. We're seeking support from the Mexican Film Institute for that, and also from the Ford Foundation, which has a strong office here in Mexico City. So I think that takes us up to present day on the film.
Wow, that must have been really challenging. And I'm sorry that things kind of went askew right when you were getting your film finished. That must have been really tough, but I'm glad that you're plugging along. And Diana, can you tell us a little bit about United Skates? I noticed that there were 22 different entities listed just on your title card as co-funders or co-producers. How do you work when there's so many different components? And I know you had John Legend as an executive producer, but there were also like many other executive producers. So how do you manage to work with so many different entities having input and just see through your creative vision through all that?
Great question. I had the opposite experience. I am gleaming from Claire to making my film because I did it the scrappy, independent, had no money route. There was no production company behind me. There was no money at all when we started. And one of the beautiful things about making a documentary, I think, is that as a first-time filmmaker, you can do it on your own for a really long way. You don't need a lot of money if you learn how to shoot, if you do all the jobs yourself. And not that I am encouraging someone to do this, because I think all of my grays and wrinkles came from doing so, but you can really prove to the world, if you know that you're a good storyteller and you have a story that you want to tell, you can get pretty far in the beginning without a lot of money and just being scrappy. And so I was on a panel in BFI London that was all women filmmakers, and one of the women said something super interesting, which was that men can often get funding in development because they can walk into a room and pitch an idea, and there's already kind of this trust and belief that they're going to execute. And women have to prove ourselves every time. And so women usually get funding in post. And that was certainly the situation for our film. We applied and applied and applied, and writing grants takes so much time. And it's frustrating because you want to be shooting, you have a story you need to make, you need money to survive. I worked 4 side jobs while making the film and never paid myself to make the film. But, and so it's pulling you away to be writing these grants that are often 20, 30 pages long. And you're also changing what you say for each grant because every granting organization is looking for something different. You're tweaking your budget because some grants want you to have a bigger budget, some want you to have a smaller budget. I probably have 16 budgets from the film that we made, and I don't think any of them are accurate, to be perfectly honest, because so much work is done for free. And how do you track those hours? And how do you really look at what it's costing you to make the film in all of your time for free? So all that being said, we got really far, just me, one other woman, Tina, shooting it ourselves, editing a bunch of early stuff myself, producing it ourselves, directing it ourselves. And then you get to a point when you need to hire an editor. And the editor is probably the biggest part of your budget because they're now sifting through what in our situation was almost 500 hours of footage by the end of the film. We had done some sifting along the way. I highly recommend constantly washing your rushes and taking notes because you forget. But the huge majority of our budget was editing and post-production. So we got to the place where we started getting grants. We got a Sundance grant. We got a Chicken and Egg grant. We got into to Film Independence Lab. We did a Sundance Lab. When you get one grant, then it's easier to get your next, and then it's easier to get your next because you start the ball rolling with some momentum. And so one recommendation is I would say go for the lowest hanging fruit first as your first grant, because then you can at least say, hey, I've raised some money from this organization. Like, don't shoot for Sundance as your first grant you're going to get, but slowly build your momentum. And so
it's not like getting into a film festival where you might not be able to get into a bigger one if you accept a smaller one. It's the opposite. Yes. And so to answer your question is a very long-winded response, but we just needed money in the end. And one way to get it when you don't have a lot to offer is a title. And so, we were willing to give executive producer and co-producer titles and credits in exchange for money to finish our film. And so we kind of had 2 categories. We had our soft money, which came from grants. We raised, I think, about $250,000 in the end, just in free money. That's the best money because you don't have to give it back. And then we raised about another $250,000 in investment money. And that is the worst kind of money because you have to give it back plus interest. And when you're a first-time filmmaker, they like to make that interest really, really high. So when you sell your film, they're the first, after your sales agent, they're the first ones to get their money back plus a lot of interest, which means you likely won't get any unless you sell your film for a lot of money. So the bleak truth. So all of those names of executive, one thing that was important to me, and I highly recommend to all of you too, is to keep your creative rights. And even if that means that you give away more, in my situation at least, I preferred to have the final say and to not have 100 voices telling me what the film needed to be. And there's a cost to that. And so, I felt very passionate about telling the story right. I was telling a story that was not my own, which is a whole nother conversation and a very long process to
decide if I even should be making it. You should always be checking yourself. Are you the right filmmaker to be telling the story that you're telling? And if you're not, to step aside, even though that's hard. And I actually did tell myself I should step aside, and did in the beginning of making my film. And it was the community that kept reaching out and saying,
can you explain a little bit, if to people who haven't seen the film, why you might not have been the right person to be telling the story, or how you went about bringing more people into it so that it worked out for you to be telling it?
Sure. So United Skates is basically looking at racism in America through the lens of roller skating. And we learned early on that most roller rinks in the US are still segregated. There's still white nights and black nights. And on black nights, there's this beautiful, vibrant, celebratory world that's been going on for generations that hasn't gotten a lot of documentation and press. And so we happened to walk into one of those nights. We were invited in, but when we got there, so I say we, it was me and one other woman making the film. She's Vietnamese Australian, so neither of us were black. And we got to this first roller rink, and there was a line down the block. You could hear the music pumping. It was one in, one out at the door, this crazy scene. And we were very aware that we didn't look like anyone else around us. And we actually put our cameras away and said, what right do we have? We don't know where we are, who we're with, apart from the people that invited us there. And we just made friends all night, talked to people, enjoyed this most amazing celebratory environment, and kind of turned around and said, wow, that was very special. I hope someone makes a film about this, because it's very important, but it shouldn't be us. And so we went back to New York, where I lived at the time, and I had made friends on Instagram and Facebook with some of the people I met, and they kept reaching out and saying, we've really appreciated you. We want you to shoot us. Would you be interested in coming to another event? And so ultimately what we decided to do, long story short, was we went to another 2 events, interviewed a few people, put together a teaser, and then went to an event in Atlanta that had about 3,000 black skaters there. And I was there alone, and I showed this teaser, and I just said, up front, I said, I don't want to make this film if I'm not doing it with you, by you, and for you. And so please, I have no skin in the game right now. If you don't want us to make this film, we'll walk away. And if you do, please come to me afterwards and help me to basically just be the bridge to amplify your voice through what I know how to do, which is filmmaking. And they watched it, and we had a standing ovation at the end, and I got mobbed by people just saying, you got to meet my uncle so-and-so who invented the this and that. And so I made some early rules with myself to constantly check in, to make sure I was never telling my story, but to tell their story. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of responsibility. It's a lot of understanding why, when people are angry that you're telling the story, that you take the time to talk to each one of them. I made rules with myself, such as if I interviewed anybody on camera that was giving information and teaching about this history and community, they had to be black. Even though I interviewed many brilliant race historians who said great things that weren't black, I did not use any of them on screen. That was a personal choice for me. I made sure if I went into any roller rink around the country that I didn't go in unless I was brought in by a skater from that city, so that that I never went in as a stranger. Yeah, I could go on and on, but I just highly recommend, especially in this day and age, to really ask yourself that hard question of whether you're the right person to tell the story. And if you feel so passionately that you are, then to make sure that if you're not from that community, that you are constantly working with and having allies from that community doing it with you. And so I also had a couple of consulting producers who were very, very talented filmmakers in their own right that were there with me along the way in the edit room as we shaped the story. And yeah, it's just, but I don't know what else to say on that.
That is really fascinating, and I think so helpful for everyone to remember. One of the really great questions is, am I the right person to be telling this story? And I read another really great question, which was something that Roddy said in some random interview I found on the internet somewhere. And you said, you know, why this particular story matters and why now is one of the questions that you want people to consider. I think you were talking about when you're making a grant application. And so I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about that situation of what kinds of things you want to put into an application or a funding application, and also what you said in that same interview about that filmmakers need to talk about audience engagement, or they need to think about the audience for their film and how they're going to help present it and get it out there. Like, you can't all just expect that you're going to just get a Netflix offer after you premiere at Sundance and then you can kind of wash your hands after that. So can you talk a little bit about that? And because I think that those are some great questions to answer.
Yeah, I mean, Deanna spoke really well about, and so did Dana, about seeking and securing soft money grants for your project. And I do agree that, you know, the more you can do that, the better off you are. It is very hard and very competitive. And the lower the barrier to entry, meaning the more people who can apply, the more competitive it is. So how do you situate yourself to be in the best possible position? I mean, one of the great things is that it's not about, you know, who you are and your famous name and so on and so forth, but it is about, you know, the project that you're presenting and your relationship to that. I always said to filmmakers that essentially, I believe that when you unlock your story, that's when you unlock the money. Okay, so to the degree that you're like, I want to do something about, something broad, you know, immigration. I used to always get like, I want to do something about the Roma, you know, or something about education. It's like, okay, that's not a movie, that's a topic, you know. So, you know, like, what is the story? What is the person or group of people or community with a passionate goal and all the storytelling things? You're not going to know the whole arc and sweep of the thing, but to the degree that you've got that kernel, that passion, that compelling thing, and a set of dramatic questions, be they conceptual or be they questions facing, you know, that person, place, or thing, right? That we want to find out what happens. So I always said that, you know, in the documentary core application, which I'm sort of the bully behind it. Like, it's ridiculous having all these different applications for all these different soft money funds. We've got to streamline this, and everybody else agreed.
Yeah, that was just such a great idea, and so helpful for documentary filmmakers. Can you explain what that is real quickly in case people aren't familiar?
Sure, it's a common set of questions that most of the film funds use. Some of them also attach supplementary questions if they target a certain type of filmmaking or type of demographic or whatever, or stage of filmmaking. But basically it still keeps the control in the filmmaker's hands to change it or target it to whoever they're talking to, but then that's up to you, versus everybody saying, tell me the same thing in 50 words or 5 pages, and you constantly rewriting if you don't want to. So it's just
it's kind of similar to like a college common application.
Yeah, like that. That's the general idea. So being able to tell a story, having a sense of that arc and sweep or potential arc and sweep, you don't know what's going to happen. And then also the why now question. Sometimes, you know, when it gets down to a real narrow pool of finalists, you might go, oh, this is a really great thing, but it could be done anytime. It could be done 2 or 3, okay. And then, you know, because you're desperately trying to fund as many as you can, right? So if it's too short time, like, you know, by the time a reviewer gets to it, it's like, oh, too late, you know, but some sense of urgency, right? as well as, of course, the filmmaker's relationship to the material, I think is quite compelling. So those are some of the sort of top takeaways from my memory. And then I agree with Deanna on the budgets. Some of them are smaller, some of them are bigger. I often looked at proportion. Definitely the lion's share of the costs are in the edit and in the post and finishing and deliverable costs people forget to think about. But if those ratios were off, I'd be nervous, you know, and want to have a talk with that filmmaker if they were a finalist or became a grantee. Because in fact, filmmakers do so much, you know, in-kind sweat equity. But even if you're paying, you know, even if you were paying, you know, those are the things to think about. I will say that I think the filmmakers who are part of the Documentary Producers Alliance, and just to make this distinction, you know, discourage people giving producer credits as distinct from executive producer credits, right, for financiers. So for financiers, executive producer credits, or, you know, desk executives, right, executive producer credits, but the producer credit should be reserved for people who are actually making the film, just to say.
Right, kind of like, same with like the feature film Oscar, has to be the person who's really working on the really.
Yeah, not the network or whatever.
Can I add also to that? I think they're also trying to make sure that we're not giving away executive producer and co-producer credits for too low an amount, because then it sets the bar too low for the rest of us. So I do think that you can go to, do they have, well, I don't know, Roddy, do they have a website?
Either they have a website or they have a Facebook page, you know, but if you look up Documentary Producers Alliance, they have a set of guidelines. Dana, were you going to chime in on that?
There's a website.
I was just gonna,
Okay.
yeah.
And all those resources are available on the website, but they've done incredible work in terms of, trying to like streamline some of these rules that for a long time we were also, now, you know, the DPA is working on financing guidelines in terms of also putting the filmmaker first, so that we're not the last ones necessarily always deferring payment and always, you know, thinking of ourselves last, you know, in a way that we have to sustain ourselves to some degree. So I think a lot of financial structures have been built so that we're the very, very last person in, and the DPA is advocating for really putting the filmmaker first in terms of, you know, recouping.
And there's this idea of pari passu, right? Like dollar for you, dollar for me. So that the investor isn't necessarily last, but the filmmaker isn't necessarily last, you know, Deanna?
Yeah. Oh yeah, I was just going to say that, you know, they can bully you as a first-time filmmaker and say, well, I want an EP credit for 20 grand, and you need that 20 grand, but that's such a low amount of money for such a big credit. And so if you give that away, then you're hurting the rest of us who are trying to say, no, you can't get an EP credit for such a low amount. And we're doing that fight. So it is something that as a network, all of us, all of you with us, have to make sure that we're all fighting together so that we hopefully will be paid before some of them, or pari passu, or getting getting the money that is valued for their credit.
I want to say something. There was a question in the Q&A. Maybe it's premature, but it kind of dovetails a little bit. There was a filmmaker who's asking about, it was more of a creative question about how to manage, you know, basically what to shoot and winding up overshooting and then having to spend years in the edit, which is very expensive. So there's a relationship. Those creative choices have an impact on your budget and your outcomes, right? Because basically, the longer it look, you know, you got to sometimes think of a film as a product. It's a phone, it's a pie, you know, it's a clock, whatever. Like, it has a market share of how many dollars, you know, it could sell for 200,000, 2 million, however much, right? You want to make it for less than that. The longer it takes you to make, you're eating your share. Okay. So your decision-making, your clear creative decision-making as a storyteller, losing my hand, as a storyteller, as a filmmaker, as a director, directing is choosing what not to shoot. Okay. So just, oh, I filmed 10,000 hours. There was this whole time period, everybody was like, I filmed 1,000 hours. I filmed 1,200 hours on every festival panel. I'm like, that's not something to boast about. That means you didn't make choice one until later. You handed somebody else your film to cut and find the story. Of course, it's a creative collaboration. I'm exaggerating to make a point, right? When I was teaching, you know, high school students, I would start them with a disposable camera with 12 frames and say, tell me a story. It's practicing that discipline. So the more you're thinking about your storytelling, who is this about? What's the question, or where are they going, or whatever? The relationship between the creative and the finance go together. I don't know if that's clear.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. And I think it's also just a matter of focus, which I don't even know if we'll have time to get to, because I'm sure we have a couple more questions coming. But I wanted to talk a little bit about covering some of the massive events of this year and how documentarians are going to address the coronavirus crisis, how they're going to address Black Lives Matter. And, you know, I'm sure maybe in 15 or 20 years, there will be like just one film you watch on coronavirus that tells you everything. But I feel like that's probably not the way people are thinking or should be thinking right now. I just want to know if you guys would agree with that right now. It's probably about finding more individual stories to tell, or just kind of honing in a little bit more on one really fascinating segment of these stories that really needs to be told right now. And I just want to know if anyone had any thoughts about covering these events of this year.
I would start. If it's not safe, you shouldn't be shooting. I mean, I think that's one of the things what we're struggling with in terms of IDA, and we've talked about if there's no cure. So going into the field right now, you're putting yourself at risk. You're putting your subjects at risk. You're putting so many people at risk. So, and yet as many people are striving to establish safe practices, we, as everyone knows, there's clearly not any. And I know that a lot of the narrative world is now like, you know, putting out guidelines and things. And yet here we are, as many of these filmmakers will say, you're usually a party of one, a party of two, you're siloed, you know, there's a lot of feeling alone in this process. So I just want to speak to that, because I think I also heard a wonderful quote, Firelight Media is having a wonderful Friday series that I really encourage you to tune into. And if you're out filming the protest, it's probably because hopefully you were already going to be at the protest. And so, you know, using all the safe practices that it takes to be at a protest and to be filming in public and to be filming the police, those are all things you got to do your homework on before you go out. So take those precautions, you know, don't just go out because you feel like there's a story. So I think that you do have to be smart, you do have to be safe, and these are difficult times. And I think in terms of speaking as a funder, you know, I would just echo everything Roddy said about, you know, story comes first. And if you're in the development stage of a lot of these big moments and you don't know, I think that's the theme of everything is we don't know, right? We don't know where the virus is going to lead for the next few months. You know, we don't know what festivals are coming back, and that's okay to say. And we always tell our applicants who are writing grants, you know, you are at least telling us the story that you want to tell. And there's a lot of confidence in that. And we have confidence then in the maker who has found this story or has a story that's, you know, personal to them, or, you know, has a relationship with the story they're telling. So I think no matter how big or small the scope of things are, story is something that we echo to all of the filmmakers who are applying, whether it's for shorts or for features or podcast. So that's our advice, is that, yeah, you continue to be safe, considerate to your crew and to the people involved in the story.
I just want to jump in here really quick to, we have about 6 minutes left. So if any attendees have questions, please go ahead and put those in the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen so the panelists can get to them.
Thanks. That's what I was going to say too. Does anyone else have any other thoughts on how you would go about finding a story, or kind of how you hone in on a story when you're looking at such massive worldwide events as the ones of this year?
Well, I think,
go ahead.
Sorry, Claire.
No, go ahead, Andrew.
You know, the most successful documentary storytelling is always has a personal element, or always should at least. And in this moment, we really need to be asking ourselves, like, yeah, what if you want to go out and make a film on the virus? If you want to go out and make a film on Black Lives Matter, like, what is your relationship to the subject? What is your relation? What is the story that you're telling particularly? Are you just running out with a camera because you want to capture this moment? You know, there was like an article a few weeks ago in the trades that was like, the race to make the first coronavirus film is just, you know, it's almost so like American too. Like, it's a competition. Now we have to make the definitive, I'm gonna make the definitive coronavirus film, and, you know, like, and I found the funding first, and now it's the race to make it happen. And it's just like,
Yeah, I
but
don't think there's a prize for the person that
yeah, I mean,
necessarily.
it's absurd.
I think it's for the person that's best more than the person that's first.
Right, we'll see what comes of it. But yeah, I mean, at the same time, it's like, what is the true urgency? Like, do you need to put people at risk to be out filming the story? Maybe you do. Maybe, you know, you do need to go out and film something tomorrow that otherwise, you know, you'll miss the story. But I think really asking yourself, like, what the relationship is that you have to, you know, to what you're trying to tell.
So
And
we have a question. If I could just break in on, is it going to be more difficult to get grants because of the risks associated with COVID? Because possibly the funders might not want people to be going out in the field as much. Is that a consideration anyone has dealt with yet?
I'll go first, but I'm curious, Roddy, where y'all are in that as well. So we currently had a grant close on June 7th, and we'll be starting the review period within the next few months. And so even though that is not part of the core application, there's always that consideration of, is a filmmaker being safe? Do they have they done their homework? You know, whether, you know, my colleague Carrie Lozano wrote a wonderful article I'd love to link into this chat, that there isn't anything similar to this. This isn't Ebola, this isn't 9/11, this isn't a war zone. So you can't do apples to apples in that when you're writing this grant. Does it mean that we're not funding films that are verite films? No, but I think, you know, and a lot of filmmakers have said, what about my timeline? My timeline is, you know, frozen right now. Well, then say that. We want to have confidence in a maker who is going to take consideration for themselves, for their story, for their subjects. And so, you know, I think this is a time none of us, no funder that I've been talking with has been through. So, you know, we still want to fund films. Thankfully, we still have the money to give. So, you know, we will fund films, and we want to fund films that that are doing those things, that are safe, and that they may have a few plans. You know, I don't think there is one plan. There is no just like, you know, cut it out pattern. This is how you're going to make this film. And all of these filmmakers can say that before COVID was even a factor. So I think just doing the best you can at explaining, you know, how you could take those steps. And maybe it's not going out into the world right now. And maybe, you know, you can still show us how you're engaged with the story, that liminal state. Like, I think we've all found ourselves in that liminal state, and it makes us anxious and we don't really know how to respond to it. But I think if you really are connected to that story, you're going to find a way, and that's what you can talk about in terms of the grant application.
Great, that's really helpful, thank you. And we had one other question. It's kind of a large topic, so I don't know if anyone is up for trying to address it, but what are some of the best tactics to stretch out the budget? We could probably talk about that for an entire hour, but does anyone have like a quick thought on that?
I think Deanna started to speak to it a little bit about, you know, how little you really need out in the field when you're starting to shoot. And you want people who can wear many hats out there. You know, you want to find a director that can shoot, you know, a DP that can do audio. You know, you want to keep your teams really lean, really mean. You want people who are really committed to the project, who are willing to work for a reduced rate, who are passionate about whatever the subject is, the story is that you're trying to tell, who feel like it's, you know, just sort of gives them soul points to work on a project that's not necessarily going to give them a huge paycheck, and they can be invested in the whole project. So you really want to search for the right team, you know, the people that can do have, all those skills out in the field. So you can really, just the smaller, the better, you can really stretch that dollar out in the field. I think in post, it's a little bit different, as everyone's also touched on, that, the dollars you sort of need to have to finish a film kind of are what they are. But yeah, I think out in the field, you can really stretch those dollars if you're making the right decisions.
Probably multiple characters in multiple cities is going to be a lot more expensive than a simpler sort of plot line, but that still has high stakes. I mean, it's easy to say, but
That's why United Skates was so amazing. All the different cities that Deanna and her team went to that was really impressive. And then also
my team of one.
What?
My team of one.
Yeah, well, that was just, setting up to shoot in all those different rinks and all those different cities and people's homes and everything, that must have really been quite a lot of work. And Andrew also had a little voyage that sounds like that must have been logistically difficult.
Yeah, but I think it's also about being flexible in your process. Like I said, we're still fundraising for aspects of the film. So you kind of have to create a timeline for yourself in your project that is realistic and says, we had this certain amount of money that covered us through the research and development process, which was really important because the filmmaker needs to support themselves at that period and also really focus on the research and the planning involved in then making the film. But then, you kind of then reach another stage where it's like, great, okay, now we can cover ourselves for this next part of the process. Like, there is that ubiquitous, financier who may come in and like give you all your budget at once, but that's really unlikely to happen. So you kind of really need to be flexible in shuffling and knowing that you might have a gap for a little while, and then just planning accordingly. Maybe that's when you're editing. Just depends.
I think Claire is right, though, that a lot of it depends on who your team is. And one thing that we did was we got an editor who had never edited a feature before, but who had edited a lot of TV. And she was looking to make that jump. And so she was already very skilled as an editor, but was looking to get a credit to change her career. So she was willing to work for a much reduced rate. I think you can also use deferred pay as a way to say, we value you. And if, we believe enough in this project that if we do sell it, that this is how much we can give you at that time and where you can be in the waterfall to be paid back. And then lastly, I would encourage you, if you can, if there are people around you in the community you're shooting with that have interest, teach them. Because the number of photos I have of random people with a headset on, listening to our Zoom recorder, making sure we weren't peeking while we were recording, or just a set of hands that are one of the characters. She had a daughter who was 12 and 15 by the end, who was just super into it and was always behind me and looking over my shoulder at what I was shooting. And so I asked her if she wanted to learn, and she did. And you can bring in assistants and it helps them too, because they feel a part of it and they get to learn. So there are ways you can stretch your budget that are also meaningful to
child labor, highly recommended.
And I think Roddy said something really important earlier too, when she said that a lot of times the biggest job of the director is choosing what not to film. And so discipline, and Andrew touched on this too, in terms of your timeline, you just need to be really disciplined in terms of what do you actually need to film, and when do you need to stop filming, and when do you have enough of the story, and then just the small pieces you might need as you make discoveries in post. But yeah, just coming from reality TV, my first few films, I did not understand that. I was like, why aren't we, in reality TV, you shoot a meal for 8 hours, I was like, why aren't we rolling? Like, what is going on? It took me like a couple of films really until I understood that. So yeah, I think that's one of the biggest learning curves for new directors and producers.
And it's always
don't always need to roll.
That when you turn off the camera, they're going to say the best thing that you wish that you were rolling. It's always going to happen.
That's so frustrating.
And then you ask them to say it again, right? Like some things, an event, a wedding, I don't know, that's gonna happen once, you gotta film it, right? No matter what. But you know, there's some brilliant filmmaker, and I'm blanking on her name right now, but she was like, most of the stuff in our lives happen over and over again. You're filming this husband and wife, and they have this argument that tells their whole marriage. Guess what? They have that argument every other week. Like, so just, you know, follow your instincts.
So it's okay to ask them to say it again.
It depends on the film, right? If you're,
Right.
you know, there's journalistic films, there's personal narrative, you know, documentary. It's a smorgasbord now, and each type of film is going to have its own rules. That's a whole other hour.
That is a whole other hour when we could talk about these hybrid films with Andrew. But anyway, I think that we probably have to wrap up now. But I thank you all so much for your participation on this panel, and keep Zooming.
Yeah, thank you all so much. This was an absolute treat, and you gave so much incredible advice. I know that everybody's very appreciative.
I know, I feel like we need to do like a checklist, or just like, you know, helpful advice from top doc people or something. Maybe we can.
If we can make it a listicle, and we can put it on like Medium or something.
Well, we can actually put it in Variety.
Oh, or Variety. There we go.
I'll tell you that. Yeah.
There we go. Yeah.
Many thanks to Pat, Clay, the Palm Springs Shorts Festival, and all the filmmakers out there.
Yeah, thank you guys. Wish we were all baking at the pool.
Good luck. Stay healthy.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.